I'm Bill Fulton, the director of the Kinder Institute. We are thrilled to have you here tonight to the Kinder Institute Forum. It's our premier lecture series, bringing urban thought leaders to Houston. This is the final Kinder Institute Forum of the year. First of all, I want to say, please live tweet this event at #KIForum. #KIForum. We'll be live tweeting, and actually we've done a pretty good job of getting our events to be trending on Twitter in Houston in the last few months, so that's really great. Also, this event is being live streamed on Facebook Live. After our speaker speaks, we will be handing out note cards for you to write down your questions. There'll be a Q&A session, but for those of you who've been here before, you write down the questions, they bring questions to me, I ask the questions, and the speaker answers them. And with such a large audience, that's just a little bit easier. The KI Forum is made possible thanks to our friends at Centerpoint Energy. So thank you, the lead sponsor for this series. Generous support also comes through a multi-year grant from our partners at Houston Endowment. In addition, the Institute also relies on philanthropic investments from many contributors: Nancy and Rich Kinder and the Kinder Foundation, Laura and Tom Bacon, Chevron, Wells Fargo, Raynette and Stan Merrick, BP America, HEB, Catherine and Hank Coleman, Sarah and Doug Fauché, Sisson Hasty Johnson, Francine Neely, Becky and Ralph O'Connor, Bank of America, Heinz, Silver Eagle Distributors, and United Way of Greater Houston. So thank you to all of our sponsors for helping us. So our speaker tonight is a longtime professor who, along the way, was a part-time mayor of a mid-sized city and is now a big city planning director. Right? Now, how anybody can have a career like that, I don't know. Maurice Cox is the planning director for the city of Detroit. He previously served as Associate Dean for Community Engagement at the School of Architecture at Tulane in New Orleans and director of the Tulane City Center. And he taught at Syracuse and for many years at the University of Virginia, and he was on the city council and mayor of Charlottesville. He also served as design director for the National Endowment of the Arts from 2007 to 2010. Any of you who participated in our Mayor's Institute on City Design a couple of years ago that we held here, that is a program of the National Endowment of the Arts. And in 2004, he was named one of 20 Masters of Design by Fast Company magazine. And in 2013 by Design Intelligence as one of the most admired design educators in America. So it is a thrill to have Maurice here to talk a little bit about what's going on in Detroit, how one seeks to achieve equity in development in a city, and what some of the lessons might be there for Houston. So Maurice Cox, thanks for being here tonight.
Good evening. Good evening. Wow, what a packed house. Houston really comes out. I appreciate everyone being here. I thank the Kinder Institute for this invitation. It's wonderful to have an Urban Research Institute allied with a premier university in your city. That has, I'm sure, helped to shape it for the better. I've been asked to speak about design and the trajectory that Detroit is on in our search for doing something we think will be a first, and that is to create an inclusive recovery of a major American city. And equity and design are at the center of that agenda. So this is not my laptop, so maybe I should try to move it over here. Excellent. So equity is obviously a very loaded word, right? It means a lot of different things to different people. And so as we were constructing the planning department from scratch in Detroit in 2015, we posed this question to all of the young planners that were congregating in the planning department. When I arrived, the city of 680 residents had 6 city planners. So part of the question was, could we build an inclusive planning department, first and foremost, for a city as diverse as Detroit? And so I went about the business of building what I think is one of the most diverse planning departments in the country, not only racially, we are a majority people of color planning department, but also in terms of the design disciplines that reside in the planning department. We have almost an equal number of city planners, architects, urban designers, landscape architects, and historic preservationists. And 70% of them live in the city of Detroit. As you can see, 55% of the leadership positions are held by women, and 12 languages are spoken. When we actually polled, the things that rose to the top had to do with access. Access to opportunity, access to excellence, access to public space, and also the questions of urban justice were paramount in folks' mind, as well as some of issues that had to do with participation and the desire and the need for people to shape the environment around them, and questions of fairness, transparency, and honesty were at the top. So what does that mean relative to a planning process? And what does it mean to recover a city equitably? It means that we address very publicly issues of displacement. We acknowledge the racial tensions in growth and transformation. Housing disparities, the blight and abandonment is a key part of what we will address. And for many, many years, the absence of government, the lack of capacity to be important to the transformation, and the litany of social and political ills that plagued the city. And lastly, of course, the media slander, which was a national campaign. That quote, "With the last person out of Detroit, please turn out the lights. Oh, too late." That was in 2012. And so Detroit is attempting to do something that we think is aspirational, and that is to try to build one city for all of us. A city that is welcoming all those who left over the course of the past half century, and that we have some core beliefs that begin from a set of seed principles that I worked on with colleagues of mine over 10 years ago, and that's this notion that every citizen has a right to live in a socially, economically, and environmentally well-designed community. So just as we have envisioned the right, birthright to have access to vote or to public education, we're trying to embrace the idea everyone has a right to public health. We believe that every person has a right to live in a socioeconomically and environmentally healthy community. So that means that design has to be at the center of it. And not just the high design, but the design of the everyday, where people live. And greater and greater exposure to the qualities that come when you put design within reach of ordinary citizens, and I'll talk more about that. But in order to understand Detroit, we have to accept Detroit is big. Detroit is really big. Now I know Houston is big, bigger, but we have some boasting rights to big things, like the big population decline. In over 70 years, Detroit lost 1.1 million people. And it was the 5th largest city in America in the mid-50s, and now it's the 25th. There's still 173 souls there. But you can see what has happened to the urban pattern in this before and after. It has left Detroit with acres and square miles of fallow land. So all of the areas you see in yellow and orange shows the percentage of occupancy per block. And so the areas that are most occupied are the green areas, and the areas that have populations that have been depleted are in yellow and orange. So if you were to take all of that land and bundle it up into a contiguous figure, it would be larger than the island of Manhattan. And this is land that is under public ownership. And so that's an important distinction about Detroit, because a city that controls its land controls its future. And so we are able to test ideas and understand what we have to retain in public trust and what we can dispose of. But unfortunately, the land mass doesn't come to us as this contiguous figure. It looks a lot like this. So within walkable geography, you might be on a block with half a dozen houses next to a block that has 2 houses next to another that's fully occupied, all within a walkable distance. So it requires a different set of tools than historically have been used by urban planners and designers. We also have an extraordinary number of vacant houses that are still under public ownership. There are 26,000 that are currently vacant and owned that really need to be demolished. They look like this. And about 5,000, maybe a little more, we think can be recovered and completely rehabbed and reused. There are about 80,000 separate parcels. So when the population left Detroit, it left its houses, its institutions behind. And this has been going on for decades. Detroit is black, and it is a city that is the largest majority African American city in America. And that goes way back to the 20th century and the Great Migration, where over 200,000 Detroiter Southerners moved to Detroit in search of those high-paying jobs in the auto industry that during World War II were converted to the war economy. So there were over 700 folks working in World War II in the production of planes and ships and weapons of war. So it was the arsenal at that point of our democracy. But that those jobs, those good-paying jobs, allowed Detroit to build the American black middle class. And so a lot of people feel, and Detroit was the place where single-family ownership and African Americans could rise to the middle class. And they were, in many ways, the last to leave. We still have a strong middle class African American population, and they are, quite frankly, planning to stay. As I said, we're the largest majority African American city in America. 80% of the city is African American, 10% Latino, and 10% white. This is an important in terms of progressive thinking about cities and how they'll be regenerated when you have a city like Detroit leading the nation in urban innovation, and it just happens to be a majority African American city. Detroit is also beautiful. I mean, culturally, it's iconic. It's known throughout the world for music and sports. Our patron saint, Aretha Franklin, lived and is buried there. So just culturally, it's an significant city and very, very self-aware of its importance in that regard. It's also just architecturally stunning. It's a beautiful city. That's probably one of the finest collection of high-rise 20th century, early 20th century high-rises in the downtown, probably second only to Chicago for Midwestern cities. But that beauty also extends to its neighborhoods. There are dozens and dozens of just gorgeous historic districts scattered throughout Detroit, and you will never find these on the internet. But these are the places where the vast majority of the population live, and these are African American neighborhoods you're looking at. It's also one of the poorest large cities in America, where the median household income is about $26,000. Okay, so imagine what happens to a city when your tax base disappears and it leaves you with a disproportionate number of people who are living in poverty. Well, in Detroit's case, it led to the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history back in 2013. And so a city that was crippled by dysfunctionality in its political process, unable to pay its bills, was turned over to Kevin Orr, an emergency manager, and was under this status for a year when the mayor I served, Mayor Duggan, was elected. And the statistics of that time were pretty crushing, with 63% of the population having left, 36% below the poverty line. It would take, the ambulances would come after an hour. The street lights didn't come on at night. About 40% of them didn't come out. So people were gotten in the habit of carrying flashlights in their glove compartment to get from their house to the door. So the city was a basket case, and the most important thing that the bankruptcy did, it buried $18 billion of debt and allowed the city for the first time to be debt-free. And so from a market perspective, to have the largest city in the state be open for business, that was a new reality. But the other part, a little less bleak, was this indomitable spirit that is so pervasive in Detroit. It's a very, very, very resilient people, that 680,000 who stuck it out through thick and thin are incredibly resilient, and they don't intend to go anywhere. And so ultimately, these are the folks who are rebuilding Detroit. These are the folks that I meet with week in and week out. It's ultimately about building a city that works for the people who stayed. And increasingly, it's also for us about building the city for the next generation who will also stay. And so all of our planning engages young people as co-creators in these plans, because they're the ones that are going to have to live with them. So a lot has been said about the recovery in Detroit. It's the downtown is receiving billions of dollars of investment, and the heart of any recovery is in one's downtown, right? It's the heart, it belongs to everyone. But I'm going to talk exclusively about the soul of the city, which are its neighborhoods. And until you have created a recovery in neighborhoods, you really haven't recovered at all. And so the vast majority of my staff and the city's efforts have been in identifying those areas of the city that are most populated, that have good bones, urban bones, strong housing stock. They have lots of issues as well, but these are the places where you would start to begin to add all of those things that make the quality of life in neighborhoods worth living. And so effectively, you can see it operates a little bit like an archipelago. There are these cities, discrete cities, that are often 7-8 miles away from downtown within the geography of Detroit. So I have started to think of it as an archipelago and it is in the midst of a landscaped area, those areas that I said have lost population. But our task is to use a set of urban strategies, which are public investments in public places. So for us, it's about the streets. We have 300 miles of commercial corridor, and we have identified 24 miles that will be publicly financed to have this extreme makeover. It's about parks and utilizing the land resource we have to reimagine and redefine what a park might be, given the land pattern that we've inherited. It's about greenways. It's about alternative modes to connect neighbor to neighbor, neighborhoods to neighborhoods, using that vacant land resource that is left over in the areas where people live. And it's about development. It's development that has character and that gets collected on these walkable urban nodes and neighborhoods. So those are the 4 strategies that are operating simultaneously and complementary to each other. So I'm going to talk about 2 examples, because that's really all the time that I have to talk about them, that talk about an investment in the single-family housing stock that we have. So it's primarily a rehab strategy, not a new single-family housing strategy, about adaptive reuse, saving the hundreds of empty buildings we have, banks, schools, recreation centers, etc., using landscape as a legitimate land use for some of the vacant land, and as well as greenways, streetscapes, and corridor development. So a quarter square mile is an increment that we've come to understand largely because it's walkable, and generally you can get to a commercial corridor. This is the Livernois McNichols area, so it's about 7 miles from downtown, 98% African American, and it's buttressed by 2 institutions, University of Detroit Mercy at the bottom of the slide and Marygrove College at the top. So that quarter square mile in the center doesn't have the traditional assets that you think of for reinvesting. And so our job was, how do we connect those neighborhoods to the assets which lie just outside of them, and by the way, build nothing in the process. And to attempt to invest in the weakest quadrant of this larger Livernois McNichols area. So you can see the median household income was much like I suggested in other places in Detroit. It's less than $30,000 per household. But you can also see other areas where household income is $100,000 and even higher. All of this within walking distance from this quarter square mile. So we set out a strategy to see if we could renovate all the vacant homes in this quarter square mile, plant intentional gardens on every vacant lot in the neighborhood, and to create a central park and a greenway using this land resource that we had. And to do that in a way that clusters the investment within this walkable geography. So the park is at the center, the greenway connects the neighborhood to the 2 universities. At the top of the slide is a commercial corridor that will receive a makeover for pedestrian-oriented public realm, and a micro-district of locally owned businesses will be clustered in a 3 or 4 block area. So all of the investment, and then of course the housing, rehab. And to do that, we have to do it with the residents who are there. So there's 600 households who still reside there. and to find different ways to empower them to shape what this resource is going to be. Everything from workforce, who tends to all of the vacant land, to coming to that community with just that resource and asking how it could be better, best utilized. And so you can see how many meetings it took to get to this rather unorthodox strategy. But this is typical of the planning process in Detroit. So the strategy is renovate 100 homes with a range of ownership and affordable rental, and to pair them with vacant land strategies, productive vacant land strategies. Some of them may be urban ag, others might be community gardens, others might be flowering meadows that simply add beauty and manage stormwater. But the development strategy is to ask the developer who knows how to renovate houses to take on the lot next door and install, according to our specifications, a flowering meadow garden. And they own both the house and the lot next door. 10 years from now, if the market suggests that new construction could happen, they would be free to replace that with a house. But in the meantime, 200 of these gardens are planted throughout this walkable quarter-square-mile neighborhood. And this is under construction. The other is, like, what do you do when you have a contiguous set of parcels? This was 26 parcels, about 2.5 acres at the center of the neighborhood. And you know, we did some demo and we cleaned it up, and that's what it looked like afterwards. And so the question is, could we take this land parcel that crosses streets and crosses alleys and turn it into a coherent multi-acre neighborhood park? And this is the plan for that park, designed by Stackman Mossop Michaels, with Elizabeth Mossop as the lead landscape architect. And here it was literally taking over the street, trying to bridge, you know, basketball from passive play, and trying to do it in a way where residents felt it had some meaning or purpose. And so it's called Ella Fitzgerald Park. And so a resident thought that you know, there needed to be music in the park. And so they suggested a song that they loved, the Dream a Little Dream with Me. And the task of the designers was to interpret that. And they interpreted that music as a kind of traffic calming mechanism on the street. And so this is the park before the clearing, basketball, a kids lot, barbecue, and this was it under construction last year. And this is it as it's been finished. And there are small cues here that may not mean a lot to us, but to those young men who are playing basketball. This was the first full court basketball court that the city has built, because they had gotten into the habit of building only half courts so that they would not promote any kind of rivalry amongst young people. So the young people in Fitzgerald understood that this park was for them when the city actually built a full court basketball court. And go figure, you would never think that these subtle signs of belonging and that you're welcome could be picked up on by young people. So it's really, I'm not going to talk about this, but the strategy for how to pay for this is incredibly complex. You're looking at philanthropic dollars, you're looking at public dollars, you're looking at corporate dollars that are all interwoven to produce a multi-layered strategy. You cannot take a single one of those on the right away and have successful and equitable redevelopment. The second area that I want to talk about is medium density housing and rebuilding the missing middle density. And how do you take streets that look like this? I'm sure Houston has streets that look like this. and change the expectation of what that street should do and be? And can you create a context where people expect to walk and shop and linger on these streets, creating a walkable environment? So we've identified 24 walkable stretches that we would like to rewrite the zoning to promote this type of development. And I've identified a number of parcels that are publicly owned to put out for RFP for market rate and affordable housing with retail, literally constructing the Main Street in many ways that used to be there back in the day, and what that might look like during modern times, and how you can create the mix of affordability as you call for developer proposals to build this. And so the first project, and you saw the range of affordability, is this parcel here at Kirtle Van Dyke, which was designed by Hamilton Anderson, that's under construction now, and with a deep affordability, the first neighborhood retail to happen on that street. But we also use other cases of smaller infill parcels within the core of the neighborhood to try to see what the corner retail housing, this is a 12-unit development, 3 of the units are affordable, but can you put this kind of quality development right next to a historic home and have them be contextually kind of sensitive? So this was a publicly sponsored demonstration to the market of the viability, and the developer is African American, and it has spawned development now on the other side of the street. But this is the context of the corridors that we have in Detroit that we believe can increase in density. And when I say increase in density, I'm talking about 5 and 6 stories. And so this project with 253 units, again, affordable, about 50% of this will be affordable. That creates, again, reconstructs the public realm in this corridor. And so kind of going from this to this. And so we have identified those corridors in the city that we think can support 6-story mixed-use buildings. All of these are publicly released requests for proposals that we then evaluate both economically. We underwrite the affordability that we want to achieve, and in both of these cases, the developers of these are African American developers. And so we have basically said these are our growth areas. These are the corridors where there will be public investment, about $49 million of public investment, and we want the multifamily higher density to go here. If you choose to do it outside of here, you're not going to get any public funding. And so the market has begun to listen and congregate around these growth nodes following the public investment. I'm going to talk about the comprehensive neighborhood. So we don't have many neighborhoods where we're starting building literally from scratch. So this is an area where the market has discovered. This is adjacent to downtown. And our challenge here is how to create an equitable and inclusive adjacent to downtown neighborhood. And so this is in search of the missing middle. It has a classic story of beautiful infill single-family development that then was wiped away for public housing. The public housing was demolished, and it left land adjacent to downtown where 60% of the land is owned by the public. And we conceived of this as a place to rebuild a complete, dense neighborhood that is oriented towards its transit location adjacent to a new queue line, which runs along Woodward. And so this was a public RFP for a block and a half, and the winning proposal proposed a variety of housing types to build this neighborhood incrementally. So it's one developer, but it's 24 buildings. It's 5 different architects, 410 units, and parking very conspicuously tucked under and behind the structures. We gave them a form-based code So each of the architects worked with a set of guidelines, and the result is what you see here, 5 different typologies that integrate units as small as 800 units on the same block as units that are 3,000 square feet. And the houses, the remaining mansions that were there, were meticulously restored. The first one, the Gillis Manson house. But our challenge here was, could we restore these homes, get duplex within them and juxtapose them to a quadruplex, a contemporary home that had a similar massing, even though there are 4 units in there and they may be less in the adjacent homes. So this interest in the form over the density. And then could we, on that same block, could we create carriage homes that would be attractive to families with children or young professionals, and have that coexist on the same block where you have very expensive townhouses. So these units here are 800 square feet. They face onto the alley, and you can buy them and live on the same block as this townhouse that you see on the left. And this street, this reconstituted street, is under construction. But we also wanted to make sure that elderly could live here, and so you could transition into senior housing. And so across the street from that is this senior block. It's been under construction and it just recently opened up. So you have affordable senior housing in this adjacent to downtown neighborhood. And so you can see the reliance on different typologies. This is a courtyard typology. This is a ground floor retail apartment building. It's gone through its final phase, and that's the result. Lorcan O'Halloran of LA has designed this. And so what we've done is we've created a map that regulates every lot in this quarter square mile based on the form, and have taken a ordinance that was dozens of pages long and turned it to 2 pages. So each lot tells you what you can do, how that form exists on the street, and gives you the freedom, if you can park it, you can turn that multiplex into a quadruplex, into a 6-plex, into an 8-plex. What we're concerned about is how this interacts with the public realm, how it's parked, etc. And so this is now part of law. It's been adopted by the Planning Commission, so we can reasonably predict the future build out of this neighborhood for the next 10 to 20 years. So we adopted this ordinance and we put it out for requests for proposals. And these were the kinds of development this one won. And you can begin to see a very different attitude. There's ground floor retail on one side, there are flats on another, and there are urban loft houses in the middle of the block around muses. And so this is the kind of development that we're seeing that's responding to the form-based code. It took us a year and a half to work through this form-based code with the community's support. But they can now reasonably predict that no one is going to build a 10-story apartment building next to their 3-story house. And we are starting to see a higher quality of architectural design emerge as a result of getting out ahead of the market and telling the market what we want. And we believe that we will be able to create this level of affordability and this quality adjacent to downtown over the course of the next 10, 15 years. So this idea of the quarter square mile and taking advantage of the assets that you have in a particular geography is now the normal process which we work. We look for a quarter square mile demonstration. The one on the left is a neighborhood where it has a 17-acre site, 800,000 square feet of adaptive reuse, and it has 40 acres of vacant land. And the anchor idea here is a tree nursery, an urban commercial tree nursery. In the middle, it's next to Eastern Market, and it's industry food production with the management of the stormwater in these linear gardens designed by Michael van Valkenburg. And you can begin to see this typology of neighborhoods that accept vacant land as an asset in its own right. We are just rolling through those 10 neighborhoods, coming up with these models, with the last one being really the only one that depends on new development because of its location adjacent to downtown. So these buildings and the quality and the landscapes you're seeing gets back to the point of the value of design in the conversation. We socialize all these designs with residents in different forms, whether it's exhibitions, whether it's interactive workshops, whether it's focus groups. When we have a conversation about their neighborhood, we're talking about the power of design, and we are willing to meet them where they are. So if it's the backyard of a community leader, that's where we meet. They invite us into their home, and we are facilitating their discussion about the future of their neighborhood. It goes across diverse types of community, whether the Bangladeshi community or artists as a community. It's not just participation, it's deep learning. People are changing their attitudes and taking far greater risks as a result of knowing what these ideas mean and what it will mean for that they're being fundamentally heard. And so just to give you a snapshot, last year my planning department, we hosted over 250 evening meetings. And that's just normal. And we will go to whatever extent to reach whatever demographic, even plastering a map on an ice cream truck to get young people to come up and talk about design, or all of those streetscapes. Again, interactive strategies so they understand what these protected bike lanes are, and newsletters and magazines and newspapers that summarize this work. So ultimately for us, it's about listening. There is no question that Detroiters are the expert. They've been in these neighborhoods for 30, 40, 50 years. I've been in Detroit for 4. You tell me who's the expert. So, but it is empowering our government, and the mayor has put planning at the center of his agenda, and it has led to, I think, the city as a real laboratory. And so we're unapologetic about the value of design. We're pushing it further and further from the center to the day where there will be more elements of design outside of the downtown core than there is in. So we talk about the power and what design can do to solve problems. And as I said, we convene, we exhibit. Every 2 years, we take stock of where we are in the revitalization of the city. This was 2 years ago, and we're doing the next exhibition in September. So the last part about this is like, how do you make any of this affordable? And Detroit is really blessed to be in a slow growth environment. We are at that point where the population is starting to grow again for the first time in 50 years. So we feel like we're at a pivot point where DC was 20 years ago. And so our task is to put in place the policies that will offset any possible displacement of those who were there. And so what you're seeing are buildings in the downtown core that have been secured for affordable housing for the next 30 years, so that we can ensure that those folks who live in these high-rises are there. And we go into every neighborhood and we tally the houses that are regulated, affordable, and the mayor and this administration has made a commitment to preserve every single one of them. And so, this next slide got a little messed up, but there's a commitment to preserve 10,000 units of affordable housing and to create 2,000 new units. And we're talking about buildings that look like this. They're extraordinary buildings in the downtown core, and we find the comparables in the neighborhoods. And so at this point, there's an affordable housing leverage fund that's been created. $250 million is our target to assure that we can meet this goal, and about $130 million is being built to fund those public investment improvements that you saw in the examples that I shared. And so we honestly believe that we have a decent shot at creating an equitable recovery, one that creates one city for all of us. Thank you very much.
If you have a question that you'd like to ask, do we have our staff out there with our, if you look to the back, you'll see our staff running around. They have note cards that you can write questions on, and those will come down to me. But I do want to start off the question and answer. If you could come on back up, and I'm wondering what I'm wondering what lessons that Detroit's a slow growth city, Houston's a fast growth city. Many of the images of the neighborhoods do not look dissimilar. But of course, the pressure on the land price and the pressure on development, is, particularly in the closed-in neighborhoods, is completely different. So I'm just kind of wondering, what kinds of lessons, having worked in many different cities, do you think the experience of Detroit can bring to a city such as Houston?
Sure. Well, I think your acknowledgement that there are neighborhoods that look just like that in Houston. I'm not sure that's where the city has directed its investment. But Detroit understands that that's the place where we can have the greatest impact. And so the big challenge has been, how do you get corporate leaders that are invested in their downtown and downtown development to care about neighborhoods that are miles away? And interestingly, creating this strategic neighborhood fund, it is anchored by corporate investment. Corporations that are headquartered downtown are committing millions of dollars, about $5 million, to be a part of this fund to effectively invest in neighborhoods, understanding that will create stability, that will create options for their workforce. And so it's both a public, philanthropic, and private partnership to fund that. Now, again, Houston is a very wealthy city, and there are lots of corporate headquarters here. I don't know if they've been challenged to participate in a strategic investment in neighborhoods. So I think that is a model that clearly could be applied to a city like Houston. I think the other thing that is a lesson that we're learning is that private investment follows public investment. So when we go in and say these streets are going to be transformed, we're effectively telling you where you should go. So we are trying to put our investment in the public realm, in public streets, in public parks, in public greenways, as a signifier to the private market where we would like you to go. And in many of the examples you saw, we had to put out the first RFP to get them to understand that there's value in those neighborhoods. It's not just neighborhoods that are adjacent to downtown. And that is also an important lesson. We don't expect developers to tell us what the future of our city should look like. I know that's I was like, a sacrilege. I said that in Houston.
We talked a little bit of this earlier today, but there was a question about industry and what you're doing to, what impact all this is having on attracting industry back into Detroit, and I think in the case of Detroit, that's mostly from the suburbs.
Right.
If you could address that and tell us a little bit about, and what the impact of all this stuff is on that.
Sure. Well, we clearly are exercising more capacity to plan our city 4 years ago, we couldn't do what I just showed you. We had to hire up. I have 40 planners now when I inherited 6. And so we can now set a framework. We can actually add value to a developer that's trying to figure something out. And so Ford Motor Company, some of you may know, just decided to relocate all of their research and development for the future of mobility in Detroit, in the historic Michigan Central Station, which has been one of the icons of Detroit's decline. And it happens to be in a historic neighborhood, Corktown. And so you've got 5,000 jobs, and these are jobs $100,000 and $150,000 landing in a Detroit neighborhood. So our job in the planning department is to figure out where those 5,000 people will live. And we intend for them to walk to work. And so much like the form-based code you saw in Brush Park, North Corktown will have a form-based code so that the majority of those folks will be walking into what we hope will be a 21st century neighborhood. But then that's one end of the job. Just yesterday, the City Council approved a $1.6 billion investment in the Fiat Chrysler plant on the east side. This is like 6 miles from downtown in a neighborhood, a historic neighborhood, Jefferson Chalmers. 5,000 jobs, average salary $89,000. I'm sorry, $59,000. These are assembly line jobs. These are jobs that Detroiters are qualified to occupy right now. And so we use that. We have a whole process of community benefits to make sure that the community genuinely gets value out of having to host these new job creating entities. And so it's been amazing, literally in 6 months, to see 10,000 jobs happen in neighborhoods, and to know that the planning department is the wraparound. We have a team of designers that will design outside of the holdings of those two entities. So.
What is the role of the, Houston recently reorganized its land bank, and obviously the land bank in Detroit is much bigger. You said something like 80,000 properties or something. What is the role of the land bank versus the role of the planning department versus the role of other city agencies versus the role of the private sector? What maybe can we learn from that as we reorganize our land bank here?
I mean, at one point I said, you know, a city that controls its land controls its future. So that's part of the reason why I'm so optimistic that Detroit will continue to be a laboratory for what the future city is, because we control 24 square miles of it under one mega authority. And so we were able to do the Fitzgerald strategy, 100 homes and 250 gardens, because of a land bank. We were able to transfer to a developer 400 parcels. And there are not many cities that can do that. That's one. There are a whole host of citywide projects that I didn't show here, like the Joe Louis Greenway, which is a 26-mile greenway that will encircle the city and tie those neighborhoods like charms on a charm bracelet. Passes straight through neighborhoods that have incomes not unlike Fitzgerald. And a lot of people have said, and they looked at the Chicago model, and they looked at the Atlanta Beltline and say, wow, that's going to be a major gentrifier. Well, 40% of the land that touches the Greenway is publicly owned. So we get to control who will live there ultimately. And so we can adjust what the market might tend to do and assure that there's affordable housing. So I think that we do the planning. We ask the land bank to not sell land in the area that we're planning. And we come up with a set of opportunities that we package, whether it be a mixed-use building or housing rehab or a green space, we have to make sure that we don't give away the asset, that we hold what we know needs to be held in public trust. But we have to really get good at disposing of land. And I would argue that the land bank needs to get better. But there have been 10,000 side lots sold over the past 4 years. That's a side lot fair. You come to a fair, you have a $100 check, you leave the fair with a deed free and clear for the lot next door to you. And the city is disposed of 10,000 lots in that way. So we're constantly trying to find ways to bundle the lots to do different things. The Banglatown project will be, we will bundle a house with 4, 8, 6 lots. We will design the perimeter border treatment, and then we will sell those to nonprofits as a way of, again, getting buy-in to these land-based strategies. What I don't want to make this sound is easy. This is really not easy. This is I say revitalization without easy answers. Trying to get the capacity for these organizations to manage land is no small feat. But I think we're making some progress on it.
You mentioned there were a couple of questions about how you connect the archipelago, and there's a reason for those questions here in Houston, which is that the Parks Board recently did a plan called Beyond the Bayous, which is intended to find ways to connect our bayou greenways to each other using utility corridors and others. In fact, Valkenburg worked on that. That's a landscape architecture firm from Brooklyn that worked on one of your projects too. So I'm just kind of wondering if you might talk a little bit about your bracelet and how you are connecting these different archipelagos that you've identified.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, obviously, the challenge was to try to tell a comprehensive story of Detroit in like 40 minutes. Kind of hard. So I had to leave out the Joe Louis Greenway and the riverfront parks. We're building 2 significant riverfront parks, so about 40 acres. One is designed by Michel Devine, a Parisian landscape architect, and the other is by Michael van Valkenburg, who's designing a 22-acre park. And the green belt converges on these 2 parks on the Detroit River. That green belt then ties into a metro trail system that finally will connect our Wayne County, that will converge at this charm bracelet and then to the Detroit River. And it's been funded by a very transformational gift of $100 million by the Wilson Foundation in Detroit. And so, you know, it's interesting because Detroit has a real love-hate relationship with mass transit, and we've had the Regional Transit Authority voted down twice. It's a millage for it, so we're going to try it again. But interestingly, it will be trails that connect the region first to Detroit long before mass transit. I think that's
similar, actually.
Yeah.
Similar. Do you get, given the circumstance in Detroit, do you get concerned by existing residents about building affordable housing nearby? And if so, how do you deal with that?
Well, I think all of the examples that I showed, and I could have showed you a dozen more, were market rate developments in which we grafted on affordable housing. And so we are not, I think the idea of building one city means that we believe deeply in all incomes being able to live, not just in the same neighborhood, but on the same block. So that strategy of having a carriage house in the back that's 800 square feet on the same block where someone has a 2,500 square foot house, that's what we mean by weaving affordability into the very DNA of the block. So we are not doing a lot of 100% low-income housing. We're except for senior, and those 2,000 units that I showed there are all percentage of the units in an otherwise market rate development. And so how do you get the developer to do that? Well, you underwrite the affordability. And that's what that $250 billion fund is for. So we have a citywide policy of 20% affordable, and then we go deeper from there. But every developer that comes in looking for some public subsidy starts at 20% affordable.
Okay. I'll just read this one. As a former Detroit teacher, and now as a Houstonian of color.
Where are you? All right.
I know how crucial neighborhood schools are to sustaining equity and access. So how will the workforce be cultivated to support the future of Motown?
Yeah, this is a big issue.
Quality schools that are economically diverse, investing in success must be part of the discussion. So how do you approach that?
Well, I think first of all you have to decide where you're going to grow, and understand that you're not going to reform the whole system at once. So we now basically have a strategy where we're going to start, and so we can begin to say what are the amenities that attract and retain families with children in those areas, and schools are one of them. Grocery stores are another. But the schools, so what I did not show is that outside of that quarter square mile of Fitzgerald, the Marygrove campus is being reimagined as a P20 institution on one single campus. The first building that will be built will be an early childhood learning center. Marlon Blackwell, an extraordinary architect out of Arkansas, is designing it on that campus. And then the first class for high school will be starting this September. And they intend to be the first campus of its kind in the nation where you can go from 0 to 20 on one campus. So that quality, and by the way, that's a 15-minute walk from that park I showed you, and the vast majority of the area that's immediately adjacent, you saw the demographic mix. So the foundation, which is the Kresge Foundation that is driving this transformation, would not be there had it not been for the initial investment that the city conceived of right next door. So you can begin to see how clustering these investments, we can't solve all of the problems, but we can create moments of innovation in every one of those 10 areas I showed. And then you can begin to demonstrate the capacity and find some new answers.
Okay, I think we got time for one more question here. Planning directors work for mayors. And you're an unusual planning director in that you weren't trained as a planner. Right. You were trained as an architect, and also you've been a part-time local elected politician yourself.
Yeah.
None of this stuff works unless the mayor and the politicians are bought into it. And this, I think, you used to run the Mayor's Institute on City Design as well, so I think that's relevant too. How do you get the mayor and the other electeds to support the idea of using design to rebuild the city and influence culture?
Yeah, wow, that's a big one.
That's why I saved it till last.
I spent a lot of time working with other mayors to try to get them to understand that the single greatest tool they had to champion their cities was equitable design, making it commonplace and raising the bar. And putting investment in public places where the public can see the investment. But to be kind of really obvious and explicit, I tend to graft design onto things that ordinary people care about. We don't talk about design in isolation or design for design's sake. We talk about the design of a park and what does it make it, how can design give you a sense of belonging. When we talk about a public realm, we talk about a streetscape where you will shop, you will go to cleaners, go to a bakery, go to a wine shop, go to an ice cream parlor. People care about these things. So it's not we're talking about design in the abstract. So I think if you can successfully graft design onto the things that the mayor cares about, and they care deeply about the quality of life for residents, then you can have a conversation about design. If you want to talk about design as this fanciful thing that you could have, you're going to get nowhere. The only we were just talking yesterday to the mayor. I presented a streetscape that creates gateways into a new into a historic district, the Russell Woods neighborhood, and it has a lot of gateways. It's modern, and the commercial properties that bracket the entry to this historic district will be painted with murals, and the murals are interpreting the culture. There are some really famous people who came from this neighborhood, the Supremes and others. So the murals will tell the cultural history of this neighborhood. And these gateways, these pillars going into the neighborhood. So we are lifting up the historic district. We are lifting up local heroes. It's beautifully designed. All he cared about was the fact that we were honoring residents and lifting them up and amplifying them and making them feel wonderful. And so we're going to spend the money to do that. So I think that's, you have to talk about the things that people care about. And you learn that when you're in politics, or you don't get reelected. I just would encourage, to have that conversation, and those who really are advocates for design, to get into the mayor's ear, volunteer for their boards and their commissions, be in the room. If you really, really care about the power of design to be transformative. So.
Okay. All right, Maurice Cox, thank you very much. The Kindred Institute Forum series for this year. We do have one more Urban Reads event. As you know, we have been bringing in authors of books about urban issues. On June 25th at the BRC, which is the building we're in, at the corner of the University of Maine, we're bringing in Alex Garvin, urban planner and designer, who will be talking about his new book about downtowns and share a lesson about what people, businesses, institutions, and public agencies can do to reactivate, energize, and sustain a city's core. That's Alex Garvin. He's done a lot of work in Uptown, actually. He's from New York. That will be our final event of the year before the summer break on June 25th. So thank you very much, all of you, for coming. Thanks to our sponsors, and thanks to the
I'm on the run. I just wanted to come over and say hi. Nice to see you. You look good.
He's the first person. Okay.